This is Counterpoint.
Welcome to another episode of Counterpoint here in the European Parliament. With us today are Anna-Michelle Asimakopoulou, member of the European Parliament from Greece and vice chair of the International Trade Committee and president of Transatlantic Friends of Israel.
Hello.
And a special guest from Washington, Behnam Ben Taleblu, senior fellow at the DC-based think tank Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he focuses on Iranian security and political issues. Let's start with you, Behnam. Sure. You've been here now 3 days. We've met with dozens of EU and NATO officials, diplomats, members of the European Parliament. And the two issues that were, of course, at center stage of our discussions were the protests and Iran's growing alliance with Russia. Let's start with the protests. We've seen scenes of unimaginable bravery by the Iranian people in the face of merciless crackdown by the regime. What makes these protests different from similar uprisings in the past?
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you both again, and thank you for the invitation both to come to Brussels as well as to share my analysis with you. There's already amazing work being done in the European parliaments, but in essence, these protests build on a momentum of anti-regime protests we've seen in Iran from 2017 to present. The Iranian people since then have been using every available opportunity, whether it's a social issue, religious issue, economic issue, environmental issue, or even foreign policy issue, to make a larger, distinctly political point. That they are done with the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and they've been showing this through geographically more diverse protests, a greater number of protests, and as many in the West, unfortunately, particularly back in Washington, have misread these protests, the regime has not misread these protests. The regime always saw these as anti-regime protests, which is unfortunately why they've been met with such a brutal crackdown. And the Iranian people need our moral support, our political support. There's a lot more that the West can do to put its money where its mouth is on standing with the Iranian people, on being better on human rights, and most importantly, naming, shaming, and identifying all of these rights abusers, some of which have ties and children and regime elites and their friends abroad.
When you say some in the West have misinterpreted the protests, what do you mean specifically?
Well, in essence, they've categorized them as, some of them have categorized them as being part of the older trend of protests in Iran from 1999 or 2009 that were tied to a certain faction or a certain element of the Iranian government seeking reform. No, these seek revolution. And more broadly, it means that we have misread, or some have misread in the West, the trigger for the protest as the actual sustainer of the protest. So it would be a mistake to see this only as an anti-hijab protest, just as it was a mistake to see only the November 2019 protest as an economic protest.
Right. Anna-Michelle, this House has actually dealt with Iran, particularly Iranian human rights violations, quite a bit. Most recently last month, where with an overwhelming majority, Iran was condemned, the regime was condemned, and called for sanctions. But your intervention was particularly memorable. You addressed the High Representative Borrell quite directly, who was sitting very close to your podium. What is it that you asked for?
Well, look, we had first of all, thank you also for being here. It's been really great to learn from the expertise. But this was a very emotional discussion, you know, about Mahsa Amini, and it was a very high-pitched moment, let's put it that way. But I mean, let's say the EU is good at condemning when it comes to words. Where we're sort of behind is action. So yes, the sanctions that have been put are in the right direction. By the way, Iranian diplomats can still walk around in this building and visit EU institutions. That, you know, that should be something maybe that we want to think about.
Right.
Now, I understand that it might be very difficult to be like finance the revolution. Obviously, you're not going to do that. But between words and actions, there's a big distance. What I asked him to do was to condemn the IRGC. I mean, it's very obvious that they're playing a huge role in the brutal crackdown, as you called it. So at the very least, what we should do is designate it as a terrorist organization, because that's what it is.
Right.
Now, the EU has to take sides. I also think it's eulogy time for the JCPOA.
Right.
I mean, we might as well stop discussing this as if it's plausible. Clearly, nobody wants to give money to Iran right now, I mean, with what it's doing. And I think it's a good moment for us, let's say, to focus again on Iran. Those of us who deal with Israel and the Transatlantic Friends of Israel understand the situation between Iran and Israel very well. It's time for Europeans, now that they're seeing the drones financed by Iran going to Putin, it's time for them to realize that Iran is not an Israeli problem, it's an international problem.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the other issue that, of course, dominated our discussion here, the growing alliance between Russia and Iran. Russia and Iran have been partnering in war crimes in Syria for many, many years. Unfortunately, the West mostly watched while 500,000 people or more were massacred. And now they are replicating this model with slightly different roles in Ukraine at the border of the EU. So for you, a sort of a two-part question. Can you perhaps for our viewers explain a little bit the military capabilities that Iran evidently possesses, and I think which comes as a surprise to many observers, particularly in Europe. And then second, what is the nature of this alliance and where will it progress from here?
Well, I think you asked a very critical question because Iran has increasingly been willing to play junior partner to two states which are increasingly interested in countering not just America, not just the EU, but countering the Western-led liberal world order with their very authoritarian revisionist orders of their own, and that's China and Russia. And Iran has been tightening political, military, and security ties, as well as economic ties, with China and Russia for well over a decade now. And this is despite, of course, some of the historical enmity that exists between Moscow and Tehran. Iran understands that Putin's war against Ukraine is also a war against NATO and is also a war against this Western-led liberal world order. And through a death-by-a-thousand-cut strategy against that order, Iran is now bolstering Putin's military machine in Russian-occupied Ukraine through the provision of drones popularly called suicide drones, or technically called loitering munitions, that basically allow Putin to save money on his unmanned aerial threats and save money on his long-range strike capabilities. So Russia, to target the critical infrastructure and energy infrastructure of Ukraine, which it has been doing and will continue to do, is using these cheaper Iranian weapons, forcing the Ukrainians to have to spend more on their defense, forcing the Ukrainians to have to spend more on aerial defense, and also making it harder to protect different targets at once, because these drones are so many and many of them can be launched at once. So in essence, Iran is materially underwriting. Even though it's a conventionally weak military power, it's asymmetrically quite strong. Because while Russia in the past few decades has become a conventional military power, the Islamic Republic of Iran has mastered this asymmetric arc of unmanned aerial threats. Mortars, rockets, drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, to the pace of it essentially becoming the largest and most diverse ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. And there are reports that Iran is going to supply Russia with not just more drones, but unfortunately with precision strike, single stage, solid propellant, short-range ballistic missiles. And the Middle East has suffered at the hands of these drones and ballistic missiles for a long time now. Now that threat radius is being exported out of the Middle East, and the threats that Israel and some of the Arab states of the region have faced are now threats that the Europeans and collective European security is facing through these tightening ties between Russia and Tehran.
Right. So the human rights front is one issue, and we discussed that we need to be much more aggressive on this front. But the security level that you also described is, of course, brings us into a whole different dimension.
Of course.
And Iran is not just a threat to Iran; it's a threat, not just a threat to Israel or the Middle East. It's now a threat on our border. You already broached the issue of the JCPOA. So how can Europe really confront this threat? And do you think there is actually even now really an acknowledgement and a realization of the magnitude of the threat that Iran poses?
Well, I remember back in January when the Americans were saying, oh, Putin's going to invade Ukraine, Putin's going to invade Ukraine. Basically, nobody believed him. And I remember I've been in this house. This is my first mandate, as you know. I've been here for three and a half years. And all my colleagues from the Baltic states were saying, Putin's going to invade Ukraine, Putin's going to invade Ukraine. He has a revisionist agenda. Just listen to what he was saying last summer. Read what he, read. You don't have to read between the lines. He's mobilizing on the borders, and it happened. So I think what Europe needs to really understand is, as a European Union, is that it needs to up its game when it comes to protecting itself. When you allow one autocrat revisionist and you give them space to maneuver, then that's like an invitation to all the rest of them. That's an invitation to Iran to, jump in the game. It's an invitation to places like Turkey, which has, by the way, the same revisionist autocrat agenda that is, systematically violating our airspace, that is, has pronounced us, just like Iran says, death to the Jewish state, Turkey says, will invade you by night. So when you hear autocrats speaking that way, and when you see what they're doing, when you see that Iran is supplying drones, and actually I learned from you today that there's a factory in Tajikistan producing drones, which are going to the Russians, and that also in Venezuela, there's a company that...
And Ethiopia.
And we're actually preparing a written question to the Commission saying, what are you doing about this? So enough with the words. I mean, it's time for the heavy-duty sanctions to come out. We did it for Putin. We should be able to do it for Iran.
Well, thank you both so much for being here and for your work. And thank you for watching, and tune in to our next episode of Counterpoint.